The winter of 1944 found the Western Alliance confident, perhaps even complacent. The heady rush from the Normandy breakout and the liberation of Paris had given way to the grim, attritional fighting of the Hurtgen Forest and the slow push toward the German border. The front lines were stretched, supplies were strained, and many Allied commanders, including Eisenhower, believed the German army in the West was a beaten force, capable only of a stubborn, defensive fight. They were catastrophically wrong. In the deep, hidden bunkers of his Adlerhorst headquarters, Adolf Hitler was concocting a plan of breathtaking audacity and staggering risk. While his generals saw the inevitable logic of defense, the Führer lived in a world of Wagnerian fantasy, where willpower alone could reverse the tides of history. His plan, codenamed Watch am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was not a defensive measure. It was a massive, concentrated counteroffensive, a lightning strike through the very same Ardennes forest that had served as the gateway for the Blitzkrieg against France in 1940. The objective was nothing less than the strategic and political collapse of the Western Allies. Hitler's goal was apocalyptic in its ambition. 3 armies, the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies and the 7th Army, comprising the last operational reserves of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, would smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. They would race for the Meuse River, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and in doing so, split the British 21st Army Group from the American 12th and 6th Army Groups. The Führer envisioned a second Dunkirk, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and forcing a political settlement that would allow him to throw his full, undivided might against the advancing Soviets in the East. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing roll of the dice, a final, furious lunge from a mortally wounded beast. The chosen battleground was both a tactical masterstroke and a profound insult to American capabilities. The Allied High Command considered the Ardennes, with its dense woods, deep ravines, and limited road network, unsuitable for a large-scale offensive. Consequently, they manned this quiet sector with inexperienced or battered units, the U.S. 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, fresh from stateside training, and the 28th Infantry Division, which had been sent to the Ardennes to recuperate after the meat grinder of Hurtgen. The front was dangerously overextended. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the pre-dawn stillness was obliterated by the roar of over 1,900 artillery pieces. A hellish bombardment crashed down on the unsuspecting American positions. Then, from the mist and darkness, emerged the spearheads of the German assault. Columns of King Tiger and Panther tanks, followed by grenadiers in their distinctive splinter pattern camouflage, surged forward. The initial shock was overwhelming. Isolated American outposts were overrun. Communication lines were severed. Confusion and panic began to spread. For the first few days, the German advance, though meeting fiercer resistance than anticipated in places, seemed unstoppable. The offensive created a massive bulge, a salient pushing deep into the Allied line, from which the battle would take its name. The 106th Division, caught in a pincer movement around the Schnee-Eifel, would suffer one of the most devastating American defeats of the European War, with over 7,000 men surrendering. The northern shoulder of the offensive, held by the V Corps, held firm, but the center and south began to crumble. As the Panzer divisions clawed their way westward, their progress was marked by a trail of horror. The Malmedy massacre, where Waffen-SS troops murdered 84 American prisoners of war, became a symbol of the enemy's fanatical brutality and erased any notion of a clean fight. The noose was tightening not just on the map, but around the morale of the entire Allied command. The clear, forward momentum of the autumn had been shattered. In its place was a chaotic, bloody struggle for survival in the bitter cold and snow. The clear skies of summer were gone, replaced by a solid, low overcast that grounded the mighty Allied air forces. Hitler's most crucial, calculated gamble. And in the center of this storm, at the convergence of 7 hard-topped roads essential for moving an army, lay a small, unassuming Belgian town that neither side had given much thought to a week before. Its name was Bastogne. As the German spearheads bypassed points of resistance to maintain their momentum, they began to flow around this critical road hub. The noose was tightening, and Bastogne was swiftly becoming the knot at its center. The race to save it, and with it, the entire Allied front, had begun. In the grand, sweeping arrows drawn on situation maps at Supreme Headquarters, the small Belgian town of Bastogne was a simple dot, a node where lines of communication converged. But in the brutal, practical reality of moving a modern army, it was the linchpin. Nestled in the rolling, forested hills of the Ardennes, Bastogne held no great factories, no symbolic value. Its worth was purely, coldly functional. It sat at the crossroads of 7 major paved roads. In the dense, road-bound terrain of the Ardennes in winter, where off-road movement for tanks and trucks was nearly impossible, control of these roads meant control of the pace and direction of the entire German offensive. As the Panzer divisions surged west, Bastogne transformed from a dot on a map into the most critical piece of real estate in Europe. The initial German plan, crafted with a staff officer's precision, had largely bypassed Bastogne. The primary Schwerpunkt, or point of main effort, was further north, with the 6th Panzer Army aimed at the Meuse River. The 5th Panzer Army, under the command of the able General Hasso von Manteuffel, was tasked with a supporting, yet equally deep, thrust. Manteuffel, a pragmatic and skilled panzer leader, understood logistics. He knew that his tanks and trucks, guzzling precious fuel, would need these roads to maintain their momentum toward the Meuse. Bastogne was the circulatory heart for any sustained advance in the central sector. It could not be merely bypassed, it had to be controlled. For the Allies, the realization of Bastogne's importance dawned with terrifying speed. As reports flooded in of broken lines and rapid enemy advances, the crossroads town became the obvious cork for the bottle. If the Germans held it, they could funnel their forces westward with impunity, resupplying their spearheads and threatening the entire defensive structure of the American First Army. If the Americans held it, they could severely disrupt the German timetable, forcing the panzer columns onto muddy, secondary trails, bleeding them of their momentum and precious fuel. Holding Bastogne was like placing a boulder in the middle of a fast-flowing stream. It would divert and break up the current of the attack. The first American units to grasp the storm were not elite paratroopers, but a collection of engineers, tank destroyer battalions, and shattered remnants retreating from the front. They were their alarm troops, a thin, desperate crust of defense. The 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B, CCB, under the command of Colonel William L. Roberts, raced into Bastogne on December 18. Roberts, seeing the chaos, made a fateful decision. Instead of concentrating his force, he broke it into 3 small, team task forces, Team Cherry, Team Ahara, and Team Desabry, and sent them to hold the key entry roads to the east and northeast. These teams, consisting of a few tanks, a platoon of infantry, and some engineers, were like fingers desperately trying to plug holes in a crumbling dike. They were buying time, engaging the vanguard of the German XLVII Panzer Corps in violent, meeting engagements on the approaches to the town. The situation was dire. The 28th Infantry Division, which had been holding this sector, was disintegrating under the onslaught, its soldiers streaming back through Bastogne in disorganized groups. The civilian population of the town watched in horror, many choosing to flee or hide in their cellars. The air was thick with the sound of distant artillery, the crump of explosions drawing nearer, and the frantic shouts of American officers trying to establish some semblance of a defensive line. The command structure was ad hoc, a chaotic mix of units answering to whomever was nearest and seemed to be in charge. It was into this cauldron of confusion and impending doom that the first trucks of the 101st Airborne Division rolled on the morning of December 19. They had been roused from a rest camp in France and driven through the night, 107 miles in open trucks through freezing rain and snow, not knowing their destination. Their commander, General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, D.C. The acting commander was his assistant, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. As the paratroopers, tired and cold, jumped from their trucks, they were met by the harrowing sight of retreat and the sounds of a battle closing in. There was no continuous front line. There were only roads to be blocked, hills to be held, and a perimeter to be formed. McAuliffe, a calm and unflappable artilleryman by trade, quickly absorbed the situation. He integrated the scattered units of the 10th Armored, the remnants of the 28th, and his own elite paratroopers into a defensive ring around the town. The paratroopers, trained for offensive, deep strike operations, now dug foxholes and set up machine gun positions in the frozen fields and woods outside Bastogne. They were surrounded before they even finished deploying. The noose, woven by the advancing German divisions, was pulled tight. Bastogne was now an island in a German sea, its 7 roads, the very source of its strategic value, now serving as the invasion routes for its besiegers. The stage was set for a siege that would become the stuff of American legend. They arrived not as liberators, but as firemen rushing to a 5-alarm blaze. There were no triumphant welcomes, only the grim, confused faces of retreating soldiers and the distant, ominous thunder of German artillery. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, their screaming eagles, had been snatched from a well-earned rest in the French town of Mormelin. They had expected to be refitting for the next offensive. Instead, they found themselves packed into open-top trucks for a freezing, all-night ride into the heart of a collapsing front. They were entering Bastogne not to secure a victory, but to prevent a catastrophe. And they were doing it without their commanding general, Maxwell Taylor, who was in Washington. Leadership fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a man whose steady demeanor would soon become the bedrock of the American defense. The scene that greeted them was one of utter chaos. The roads were clogged with the debris of a broken army, shattered jeeps, burning trucks, and dazed soldiers from broken units like the 28th and 106th Divisions, stumbling rearward with hollow eyes. The air was cold enough to freeze breath, and a mixture of snow and sleet fell from a leaden sky. There was no front line. There was only a series of approaching threats down the 7 critical roads that led into the town. McAuliffe's first task was not to attack, but to simply create order from the anarchy. He quickly established his command post in the basement of the Heinz barracks in the town center, a decision that would prove fortuitous as the shelling intensified. The division's regiments were thrown into the breach like pieces of a puzzle, each assigned to plug a gap in the disintegrating perimeter. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, PIR, moved to the northeast, toward the key towns of Bisy and Foy. The 506th PIR dug into the north and northwest, its positions covering the vital road from Foy and the open fields beyond. The 502nd PIR took up positions to the west, and the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment stretched itself then to cover the long southern and southeastern approaches. They were not alone. The battered but determined teams from the 10th Armored Division, Cherry, Ahara, and Desabry, were attached to these sectors, their few tanks and tank destroyers providing the crucial anti-armor backbone the lightly armed paratroopers desperately needed. What followed was a brutal race against time and the elements. The ground was frozen solid, making it agonizing work to dig foxholes. Men used entrenching tools, pickaxes, even bayonets, to scrape out shallow pits in the iron-hard earth. They lined them with whatever they could find, fir branches, straw, pieces of cardboard, anything to provide a scant layer of insulation from the pervasive cold. There were no heated tents, no hot meals. Supply lines had been severed almost immediately. The men wore the same uniforms they had climbed into the trucks with, now soaked through from the snow and sweat. Frostbite became a constant enemy, as merciless as the Germans. Their equipment was that of light infantry, designed for speed and agility, not for holding a static line against Panzer divisions. They had their M1 Garans, Browning automatic rifles, and bazookas. Against the heavy frontal armor of a German Panther or Tiger tank, the bazooka was often useless. The paratroopers learned to let the tanks rumble past their hidden positions, then rise to engage the following German infantry with rifle fire and machine guns, isolating the armored vehicles and making them vulnerable to the few, precious Sherman tanks and tank destroyers. The first major probes began on December 19, hardening into full-scale assaults by the 20th. The German XLVII Panzer Corps, commanded by General von Luttwitz, began to test the American perimeter from all sides. The fighting was savage and at close quarters. In the woods near Foy, the 506th's Easy Company, later immortalized as their Band of Brothers, fought off relentless attacks, their lines so thin that at times men could hear the Germans talking in the forest opposite. To the east, Team Desabry at Noville and the 501st fought a desperate, costly battle against the Panzer-led division, trading space for time and inflicting heavy losses on the Germans. It was in these first few days that the identity of the 101st in Bastogne was forged. They were not a perfectly supplied, invincible force. They were cold, hungry, outgunned, and surrounded. They were a mixed bag of veterans of Normandy and Holland and Green replacements, all bound together by a shared, grim determination. They took a grim pride in their predicament. A reporter, embedded with the division, would coin the phrase that would define them forever. When asked by a German envoy about surrender, McAuliffe's legendary one-word reply, "Nuts," perfectly encapsulated their defiant spirit. The story spread like wildfire through the frozen foxholes, a massive boost to morale. They were no longer just the 101st Airborne, they were the battered bastards of Bastogne. They held not because they were supermen, but because they were stubborn. They held because their training and cohesion were superior to the piecemeal German assaults. They held because their artillery, expertly directed by forward observers who risked their lives on the front lines, was devastatingly accurate. And they held because, in the freezing foxholes of that besieged perimeter, the alternative to holding was unthinkable. They had dug in, and they would not be moved. The air in the cellar command post of the Heinz barracks was thick with the smell of damp wool, cold sweat, and the acrid scent of burning map paper used to light cigarettes. It was the afternoon of December 22, 1944. The men of the 101st Airborne had been surrounded for 3 days. They were running low on medical supplies, artillery shells, and, most critically, the will to endure was being tested by the relentless cold and the constant, grinding pressure of German attacks. Into this atmosphere of grim endurance, a bizarre and almost theatrical interruption occurred, one that would crystallize the American defiance into a single, immortal word. Under a flag of truce, a party of 4 German soldiers emerged from the fog-shrouded tree line to the southwest, near the positions of the 327th Glider Infantry. 2 were enlisted men, carrying a large white flag. The other 2 were officers, a Major Wagner of the Panzer Division and his aide, Lieutenant Helmuth Heinke, who served as the translator. They were blindfolded and led through the American lines, a process that took time and added to the surreal nature of the event. They were eventually brought to their command post and presented to General McAuliffe, who was, at that moment, trying to coordinate the defense of his collapsing perimeter. The German officers stood stiff and formal. Through his translator, Major Wagner presented a typewritten document. It was an ultimatum from General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the XLVII Panzer Corps. Their message was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a blend of feigned chivalry and stark threat. It opened with the words, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne." It went on to paint a bleak and, in many respects, accurate picture of the American predicament. It spoke of the encirclement by strong German armored units, the futility of further resistance, and the impending annihilation of the 101st Airborne Division. It offered an honorable surrender to avoid a total annihilation. The ultimatum gave the Americans 2 hours to consider. The document was signed, the German commander. McAuliffe, tired and preoccupied, read the message. His initial reaction, according to those present, was a short, incredulous laugh. A surrender? Or, nuts, he said, almost to himself. He tossed the paper on the floor and turned back to his maps, dismissing the entire affair. But his staff officers pressed him. A formal reply was required by the rules of war. They could not simply send the Germans away. The problem then became, what to write? How does one formally respond to such a grandiose demand? McAuliffe's staff suggested simply, nuts, but the general knew a more official response was needed. He pondered for a moment, then said, "That first remark of mine, that's the reply I want to send." He instructed his intelligence officer, Colonel Ned Moore, to draft it. What happened next has entered the realm of legend. The official, typed reply was prepared. It was brief and to the point. To the German commander. NUTS. The American commander. The German officers, still blindfolded, were presented with the reply. Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th, was tasked with delivering it. He led the party back to the point where they had entered the American lines. He removed their blindfolds. Lieutenant Heinke, the translator, took the paper. He read it, confused. The slang was utterly lost on him. "What does this mean?" he asked Harper. Is this affirmative or negative? Harper, a tough regimental commander, enjoyed the moment. It is decidedly not affirmative, he replied, a grin spreading across his face. He then spelled it out for the bewildered Germans. It means the same as go to hell. And I will tell you something else, if you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city. The Germans, their faces a mixture of offense and disbelief, saluted stiffly and turned back into the fog. The impact of this single syllable, nuts, was electric and immediate. It was not just a refusal, it was a contemptuous dismissal. It was the perfect, unscripted expression of American defiance, informal, cocky, and utterly confident in the face of overwhelming odds. The story raced through the command posts and down into the frozen foxholes. Men who had been shivering in their boots, exhausted and afraid, now laughed and slapped each other on the back. The word was repeated like a mantra. Did you hear what Mac told them? Nuts. It was a psychological masterstroke. In one word, McAuliffe had transformed the narrative. The Americans were no longer a besieged, desperate force pleading for relief. They were defiant bastards, telling the mighty German war machine exactly where it could go. It unified the defenders in a way no stirring, formal speech ever could. It was their word, their spirit. The fog that had grounded Allied planes and hidden German movements now seemed to carry that one, defiant word, echoing from foxhole to foxhole, reinforcing the will to fight. The battered bastards of Bastogne now had their battle cry. The siege would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt in the minds of the men who held the line. They had drawn a line in the frozen earth with a word, and they would not step across it. While the 101st Airborne was digging its foxholes in the frozen perimeter around Bastogne, a drama of a different scale was unfolding nearly 100 miles to the south. In Lorraine, the U.S. Third Army, under the command of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, was fully engaged in a brutal, grinding offensive toward the Saar River and the Siegfried Line. Tanks of the 4th Armored Division were locked in a bloody fight for the town of Singling. The entire army was oriented eastward, its supply lines, command structure, and momentum all committed to destroying the German defenses in front of it. The notion that this massive, committed force could disengage, turn 90 degrees, and launch a major relief offensive to the north in a matter of days was, by any conventional military standard, preposterous. Yet, that is precisely what happened. This was Patton's pivot, one of the most spectacular feats of logistics and command will in the history of modern warfare. The story of the rescue did not begin on December 16 with the German attack, but on December 19, at a tense conference in a damp, crowded war room in Verdun. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had gathered his top commanders to address the crisis. The mood was grim. The front was shattered, and the outcome was in peril. Eisenhower, looking for a counterpunch, turned to his most aggressive commander. George, he said, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle, making a strong counterattack with at least 6 divisions. Patton, who had been studying his maps obsessively since the first news of the offensive broke, was ready. This was his moment. He did not see a disaster, he saw an opportunity. Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of bitches go all the way to Paris, he reportedly said. Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up. But his bravado was backed by meticulous staff work. When Eisenhower asked when he could attack, Patton replied without hesitation, on December 22, with 3 divisions. The answer stunned the room. To shift the axis of an entire army's advance in the middle of a winter battle was a logistical nightmare of unimaginable complexity. But Patton was not bluffing. Before even leaving for the Verdun meeting, he had already set his brilliant chief of staff, Major General Hobart Hap Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley G. Maddox, to work on contingency plans. The 3 and 12 Corps staffs were already burning the midnight oil, tracing new routes, calculating fuel and ammunition requirements, and drafting new movement orders. While others saw chaos, Patton's staff saw a complex but solvable problem in operational geometry. The moment Patton received the formal order, the Third Army's machine went into a controlled frenzy. The pivot was a ballet of organized chaos. Uncrowded, icy roads, entire divisions executed a breathtaking change of direction. The 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of the relief force, had to disengage from its fierce fighting around Singling, drive north, and then attack westward into the southern flank of the Bulge. The 80th Infantry Division pivoted from east to north. The 26th Infantry Division did the same. Every vehicle, from tank to supply truck, was part of this gigantic wheel. The challenges were monumental. The road network was inadequate and choked with military traffic. The weather, which had grounded Allied air power, was now a curse for the rescuers as well. Icy conditions caused accidents and slowed convoys to a crawl. German resistance on the approaches to the Bulge was stiff, designed to delay any relief effort. Most critically, the Third Army was beginning to outrun its supplies. Fuel was the lifeblood of the attack, and the sudden, massive consumption threatened to stall the advance before it even reached Bastogne. Patton's leadership during this period was a mix of inspiration, intimidation, and sheer theatricality. He was everywhere, pushing, cajoling, and demanding. He famously ordered his chaplain, Monsignor James H. O'Neill, to write a prayer for good weather. "I want you to publish a prayer for good weather," he said. "I'm tired of these soldiers having to fight mud and floods as well as Germans. See if we can't get God to work on our side." The prayer was printed and distributed to the entire Third Army. Patton also applied relentless pressure on his commanders. He pushed Major General John "Tiger Jack" Wood, commander of the 4th Armored, to move faster, attack harder, and take risks. When Wood expressed concern about his open flanks, Patton's response was characteristic: "I'm not interested in holding onto anything except the enemy." The race was a series of violent, small actions: a company securing a crossroads, a tank platoon overcoming a roadblock, engineers rebuilding a blown bridge under fire. Each mile gained was paid for in blood and steel. But the momentum was undeniable. The Third Army was like a tidal wave, crashing into the southern shoulder of the Bulge. By December 22, the day Patton had promised to attack, his divisions were slamming into the German defensive crust. The relief of Bastogne was no longer a question of if, but when. The most daring pivot of the war was underway, and its objective was now within reach. The promise made at Verdun had been kept. On December 22, the U.S. Third Army began its counterattack. But the reality on the ground was a far cry from the sweeping arrows on Patton's situation maps. The advance north was not a single, unified thrust, but a brutal, grinding series of battles fought village by village, crossroads by crossroads, against a determined enemy dug into the rugged, frozen terrain of southern Luxembourg and Belgium. Their Iron Monsoon was not a swift, clean breakthrough, it was a deluge of steel and fire, methodically overwhelming the German defenses that stood between it and the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The spearhead of this monumental effort was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by the brilliant and relentless Major General John "Tiger Jack" Wood. His division was the sharp tip of Patton's spear, but it was a tip being steadily blunted. The German 7th Army, tasked with protecting the southern flank of the Bulge, had established a defensive crust of fortified villages, minefields, and deadly anti-tank guns covering every approach. The terrain was a defender's dream, a series of steep, wooded ridges and deep, narrow valleys where the few paved roads were easily blocked. The 4th Armored could not simply race around these obstacles, it had to smash through them. The initial attacks on the 22nd and 23rd made painfully slow progress. At Martelange, engineers fought to rebuild a bridge over the river shore under direct German fire. At Biggenville and Osdorf, Combat Command A, CCA, and Combat Command R, CCR, ran into fierce resistance from the German 5th Parachute Division, fanatical and well-equipped Fallschirmjäger who fought with tenacity from the thick woods. The American Sherman tanks, outgunned by the heavier German Panthers and Tigers, had to rely on speed, numbers, and superior coordination with their accompanying infantry. It was a costly, attritional fight. The weather, which had finally broken on the 23rd, was now a double-edged sword. For the first time in a week, the skies cleared, and with them came the roar of Allied air power. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swarmed the battlefield, strafing German positions, bombing supply columns, and breaking up concentrations of troops and armor. This air support was a godsend for the attacking Americans, relieving some of the pressure and inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. But the clear skies also revealed the advancing columns to German artillery observers, who called down accurate and deadly fire on the exposed roads. The battle became a soldier's fight, a test of small unit leadership and raw courage. It was fought by men like Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, whose aggressive tactics and sheer force of will would see a key crossroads named in his honor, Abrams' Corner. It was fought by the infantry of the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, who, alongside the 4th Armored, had to clear the dense woods and villages, rooting out German paratroopers and grenadiers from cellars and foxholes in brutal, close-quarters combat. The fighting was savage. There was no finesse, only the relentless application of force. Patton, watching from his command post, grew increasingly impatient. He drove his commanders hard, sensing that every hour of delay meant more casualties in Bastogne and increased risk of the garrison falling. He applied pressure directly, his visits to the front a mix of inspiration and intimidation. He understood that the will to win was as important as the plan itself. The critical breakthrough began on December 25, Christmas Day, but it was not a day of peace. Combat Command B, CCB, of the 4th Armored, under the command of Brigadier General Holmes E. Dagger, was tasked with finding a seam in the German lines. While CCA and CCR continued their bloody hammer blows against the main German defenses farther east, Dagger sent his forces on a wider, western sweep. The key was the capture of the town of Sibrit, which was thought to be a major strongpoint. But a reconnaissance force from the 37th Tank Battalion, led by the aggressive Captain William Dwight, found a smaller, less defended road through the village of Audacious. This was the opportunity. Abrams and Dagger quickly organized a flying column, a combined force of tanks and armored infantry, to punch straight up the road to Audacious and then onto Bastogne. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26, the order was given. The column, led by Lieutenant Charles Bogus's tank platoon, surged forward. What followed was a wild, violent ride. American artillery laid down a serenade of fire on Audacious, pounding the village just ahead of the advancing tanks. Bogus's tank, Cobra King, led the charge, its guns blazing at anything that moved. They crashed through the village, engaging German troops at point-blank range. The accompanying half-tracks of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion disgorged their troops, who cleared the houses in a furious close-quarters fight. There was no time to secure the area fully, the column had to keep moving. Pushing past burning vehicles and dazed German prisoners, Cobra King and the few vehicles behind it broke out of the northern side of Audacious and raced down the dark, tree-lined road toward Bastogne. A few miles ahead, men of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, holding the southern perimeter of Bastogne, heard the sound of approaching tanks. They feared it was another German probe. But then they saw the distinctive silhouette of a Sherman tank. A figure emerged from the lead tank, Lieutenant Bogus. He shouted into the darkness, "I'm from the 4th Armored. I'm Lieutenant Bogus. Is this the way to Bastogne?" A paratrooper stepped forward, his face grimy and exhausted. "I'm Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Engineers. Glad to see you." The handshake was brief, almost anticlimactic. But in that moment, the siege of Bastogne was broken. The iron monsoon had broken through. The corridor was narrow, precarious, and still under fire, but it was open. Their battered bastards were no longer alone. The handshake between Lieutenant Bogus of the 4th Armored and Lieutenant Webster of the 101st Airborne in the twilight of December 26 was not the end of the battle for Bastogne, it was the end of the siege. The arrival of Cobra King and the handful of tanks and half-tracks that followed it represented a surgical incision, a single, fragile thread piercing the German ring. But a thread was all that was needed. The relief of Bastogne was not a single event, but a process, a violent, determined, and rapid widening of that initial puncture until the entire constricting band of steel around the town was shattered and thrown back. The initial corridor was terrifyingly vulnerable. It was a narrow lane, barely a few hundred yards wide in places, running from the village of Audacious north to the Bastogne perimeter. German forces on both flanks, stunned and enraged by the breakthrough, immediately brought every available weapon to bear on this new artery. Artillery and mortar fire rained down on the road. German infantry, supported by the occasional tank or assault gun, launched furious local counterattacks to sever the thin lifeline. For the next 24 hours, the men of the 4th Armoured's Combat Command B and the 101st Airborne's Southern Defenders fought a desperate, close-range battle to keep the corridor open. It was a fight for a road, a ditch, a frozen field, the most critical real estate in Europe. The first priority was to make the corridor more than a symbolic gesture. The lead elements of the 4th Armoured were not a relief force in the sense of replacing the defenders, they were a reinforcement, injecting fresh troops, tanks, and, most critically, supplies into the besieged garrison. Ambulances began making the perilous run back down the corridor, carrying the most seriously wounded paratroopers who had been languishing in overwhelmed aid stations. In return, trucks laden with ammunition, medical supplies, and, for the first time in days, food, began to flow into Bastogne. The sight of these supply trucks rolling into the shattered town was a greater morale booster than any general's speech. The battered bastards were no longer just holding on, they were being resupplied. The equation of the battle had fundamentally changed. With the corridor held open, the full weight of the Third Army's momentum could now be applied. Patton's order was simple and direct: widen the corridor and break the siege completely. The 4th Armoured Division, now reinforced and with its flanks protected by the advancing 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, began to attack outward from the corridor itself. They were no longer trying to get to Bastogne, they were now fighting to expand from Bastogne. In a series of sharp, violent actions over the next 48 hours, they systematically cleared the villages and woods that had formed the southern and southwestern portions of the German encirclement. The German High Command, particularly a furious Field Marshal von Rundstedt, recognized the implications immediately. The failure to take Bastogne had been a major setback. The successful American relief operation was a catastrophe. The entire strategic purpose of the northern wing of the 5th Panzer Army was now nullified. With Bastogne in American hands and being reinforced, the southern flank of the Bulge was unhinged. The roads needed to supply the German spearheads farther west were now threatened, and the Americans had a powerful, aggressive sally port from which to launch their own counteroffensive into the soft underbelly of the Bulge. For the German soldiers who had been tasked with reducing the pocket, the relief was a devastating psychological blow. They had thrown themselves against the American perimeter for days, suffering heavy casualties in the belief that the defenders were on the verge of collapse. The arrival of American tanks from the south, the sudden surge of fresh enemy troops, and the intensification of American artillery fire signaled the end of their mission. The initiative, which they had held since December 16, was now irrevocably lost. The relentless pressure they had applied was now being turned back on them 100-fold. By December 28, the ring was well and truly shattered. The corridor was no longer a corridor, it was a securely held, widening front. The 101st Airborne, now linked firmly with the 3rd Army, could finally rotate its most exhausted units out of the line. The constant, grinding pressure of being surrounded was lifted. The sound of the battle changed. It was no longer the inward-focused defense against probing attacks from all sides, but the outward roar of an American offensive as the 4th Armoured and the infantry divisions began to push the Germans back. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was the definitive turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. It demonstrated the stunning flexibility and power of the American army and sealed the failure of Hitler's great gamble. The town that was supposed to have fallen in hours had held out for over a week, and was now a bastion of American strength. The German mockery had ended, not with a whimper, but with the thunder of Patton's tanks and the unbroken defiance of the screaming eagles. The ring was broken, and with it, the back of the German offensive in the Ardennes. The initiative, held so firmly by the Germans for the first 10 days of the offensive, now passed irrevocably to the Americans. General Patton's orders were no longer focused on relief, but on destruction. His objective was to use Bastogne as a secure pivot point from which to launch a massive counterattack, driving northeast to sever the vital supply routes feeding the tip of the German Bulge and link up with the U.S. First Army advancing from the north. The race to relieve Bastogne was over. The battle to annihilate the German salient had begun. The first order of business was to transition the 101st Airborne from a purely defensive role to an offensive one. This was a psychological and tactical challenge. The paratroopers, though exhausted, were now buoyed by the arrival of the 4th Armored and infused with the aggressive confidence that comes from having survived a siege. They were no longer bastards, they were victors. Units that had been pinned in their foxholes for a week now advanced from those same positions, pushing patrols into the no-man's land that had recently been dominated by German skirmishers. They began to reclaim the ground they had been forced to yield in the first days of the siege, villages like Foy and Noville, which were now littered with the wreckage of the earlier fighting. But the main effort now fell to the fresh, fully supplied divisions of the Third Army. The 4th Armored Division, its spearhead role fulfilled but its mission far from over, began attacking northeast from the Bastogne corridor. Their objective was to reach the key road junctions at Houffalize, thereby cutting off the German Panzer divisions that were still threatening the Meuse River to their west. To their right, the 35th Infantry Division swung into the line, attacking toward the towns of Lutterbois and Villers-l'Arbourneau. To the left, the 26th Infantry Division pushed north and east. The battle became a giant pincer movement, with Bastogne as the southern hinge. The German response was desperate and ferocious. Understanding that the loss of Bastogne had doomed their offensive, the German High Command now sought to salvage the situation by preventing an American breakout that could trap their best mobile units. They threw in their own reserves, including elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 9th SS Panzer Division, in a series of violent counterstrokes designed to pinch off the very corridor the Americans had just opened. The days following the relief saw some of the most intense armored clashes of the entire Ardennes campaign. The fighting around the corridor villages like Assenoy, Cibret, and Chinon was brutal. German Panther and Tiger tanks, superior in armor and firepower to the American Shermans, engaged in deadly duels across the snow-covered fields. The American advantage lay not in individual tank quality, but in overwhelming artillery support, superior numbers, and the relentless, aggressive doctrine instilled by Patton. American tank crews and tank destroyer battalions used maneuver and combined arms tactics to overcome their technological disadvantage, flanking the heavier German tanks and calling down devastating artillery barrages on their positions. The weather, which had briefly cleared to allow the air support that aided the relief, closed in again, grounding planes and returning the battle to the mud and fog. The struggle became a soldier's grind once more, but this time it was the Americans on the advance. They attacked through blizzards, across frozen streams, and into forests still held by determined German rearguards. The cost was high. Casualty lists, which had been dominated by the 101st Airborne and the initial armored teams, now swelled with the names of men from the 4th Armored, the 26th, the 35th, and the 80th Divisions. This phase of the battle revealed a critical divergence in morale. The American soldier, now on the attack and sensing the enemy's desperation, fought with a renewed fury. The German soldier, by contrast, was exhausted, low on fuel and ammunition, and witnessing the collapse of his last great offensive hope. The fear of being encircled, which had haunted the Americans in the Bulge's first days, now transferred to the Germans. The vicious American counterattack was not just reclaiming lost ground, it was systematically dismantling the German Ardennes offensive and breaking the spirit of the Wehrmacht in the West. The defense of Bastogne had been an epic of American fortitude. The counterattack from Bastogne was the beginning of the end for the German army. The Battle of the Bulge did not end with the relief of Bastogne on December 26, 1944. Hard fighting would continue for another month as the Allies methodically squeezed the salient, finally eliminating their Bulge and restoring the front line by the end of January 1945. Yet, it was at Bastogne that the German will to win, not just to fight, but to believe in victory, was irrevocably broken. The legacy of the siege transcends its tactical outcome. It became the symbolic graveyard of the German offensive spirit in the West, a psychological turning point from which the Wehrmacht would never recover. For the German High Command, particularly for Adolf Hitler, Bastogne was more than a road junction, it was a test of wills. The entire Ardennes offensive was a gamble built on a foundation of disbelief in Allied resilience and a fanatical faith in German martial superiority. The failure to capture the town, despite encircling it with overwhelming force, was a catastrophic refutation of this core belief. The professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht, like General von Manteuffel, understood the logistical implications. The southern flank was now unhinged, and the roads were compromised. But for the Führer and the Nazi ideology, the stubborn defiance of their battered bastards and McAuliffe's contemptuous nuts were an intolerable insult. It was a demonstration that sheer willpower, the very commodity the Nazis claimed to possess in monopoly, was not enough. The Americans, whom German propaganda had portrayed as soft and incapable of a hard fight, had displayed a tenacity that shocked the German psyche. This shift from offensive arrogance to defensive desperation manifested immediately in German strategy. After the relief, the German objective was no longer the triumphant dash to Antwerp, but a desperate struggle to prevent the entire 5th Panzer Army from being cut off and annihilated. The powerful armored divisions that were meant to be the spearhead of the victory, the Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, and the elite SS units, were now bled white in futile attempts to first capture, and then contain, Bastogne. They were forced into a brutal battle of attrition, the very type of warfare they could not afford. Every tank lost, every shell expended, and every veteran grenadier killed in the frozen fields around the town was a resource irretrievably wasted, a piece of the Reich's final strategic reserve squandered. The morale of the German frontline soldier underwent a profound collapse. For days, they had been told the Americans in Bastogne were finished, on the verge of surrender. The arrival of Patton's tanks from the south shattered that narrative. The fighting spirit, which had been so high on December 16, drained away, replaced by a grim realization of their predicament. They were now the ones in a salient, with the Americans building up overwhelming force on their flanks. The weather, which had been their ally, now began to favor the Allies, whose unchallenged air power returned with a vengeance, strafing and bombing their supply columns with impunity. The German soldier, cold, hungry, and outgunned, saw the relentless flow of American men and material into Bastogne and understood what it meant. The industrial and human might of the United States was now fully brought to bear, and they were on the losing side. The American victory at Bastogne also had a transformative effect on the Allied coalition. In the dark days of mid-December, a palpable fear had gripped the Allied leadership. The stunning German success had revived ghosts of 1940. Bastogne became the rallying point, the symbol of resistance. The story of the encirclement and the dramatic relief was a propaganda coup of incalculable value. It proved that the American soldier, when well led and determined, could stand and defeat the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. It cemented the reputation of the 101st Airborne as an elite formation and burnished Patton's legend as a master of mobile warfare. Most importantly, it restored the Allies' confidence in their own invincibility. The legacy of Bastogne is therefore twofold. Tactically, it was the pivot upon which the entire Battle of the Bulge turned. By holding the town, the 101st Airborne and its supporting units disrupted the German timetable, diverted critical forces from the main thrust toward the Meuse, and provided the Third Army with the perfect anvil for its counterattack. Strategically and psychologically, its impact was far greater. It broke the spell of German offensive power in the West. After Bastogne, the German army in the West never again launched a major offensive operation. Its will had been broken not by a single, catastrophic defeat, but by the stubborn, defiant stand of a single division that refused to yield. The road to the Rhine, and ultimately to the heart of the Reich, was opened not in the summer of 1944, but in the frozen fields around a Belgian crossroads in the bitter winter of 1945. Bastogne was the place where the German war machine in the West, having thrown its last, best punch, found itself broken, and knew it.